From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
President Trump has just made history. He recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and he did so at a time when Iran is trying to use Syria as a platform to attack and destroy Israel. And the message that President Trump has given the world is that America stands by Israel.
Just weeks before major elections in Israel that could determine the future of embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, President Trump declares the U.S. will recognize Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights in defiance of international law and decades of U.S. policy. We'll get reaction from Palestinian human rights attorney Noura Erakat, author of the new book Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. Then the worst weather disaster in the history of the Southern Hemisphere. Cyclone Idai causes extensive flooding, leaving tens of thousands homeless, more than 400 dead in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi.
All my life, I've never seen anything like this before. It's the first time.
We'll get an update from Mozambique-based climate justice activist Dipti Bhatnagar with Friends of the Earth International. And finally, as Nebraska and the U.S. Midwest recover from devastating climate change-fueled floods, we'll speak with Lakota historian Nick Estes on how 2 centuries of indigenous resistance created the movement proclaiming water is life. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump declared Thursday the U.S. is ready to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights, which it seized from Syria in 1967. Trump announced the move via Twitter, writing, quote, "After 52 years, it's time for the United States to fully recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which is of critical strategic and security importance to the state of Israel and regional stability!" Exclamation point. After a meeting with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hailed Trump's announcement.
President Trump has just made history. I called him. I thanked him on behalf of the people of Israel. He did it again.
Israel annexed the Golan Heights in 1981. Though the international community does not recognize its sovereignty, the Syrian state news agency responded to Trump's vow to overturn decades of U.S. policy by saying it showed the, quote, blind bias of the U.S. towards Israel and that his comments had shown contempt for international law. Trump's announcement came just days before he's set to host Netanyahu at the White House during the annual conference of AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. The AIPAC event will include speeches from Vice President Mike Pence, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, among others. But a growing number of Democrats, including at least 8 presidential candidates, have said they will be skipping the summit. In a statement, the campaign of Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders wrote, quote, "Senator Sanders is concerned about the platform AIPAC is providing for leaders who have expressed bigotry and oppose a 2-state solution." We'll have more on AIPAC and President Trump's recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights after headlines. The chair of the House Oversight Committee has revealed Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner illegally used private email accounts and messaging apps to carry out official White House business. In a letter to the White House Thursday, Maryland Congressmember Elijah Cummings said Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, used WhatsApp to communicate with foreign contacts, including Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, while both Kushner and his wife, Ivanka Trump, used private email accounts in a way that appear to violate federal records laws. Cummings also revealed that White House officials, including Steve Bannon, used personal emails to discuss transferring sensitive nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. During the 2016 campaign, Donald Trump repeatedly led chants of "lock her up" as he blasted Hillary Clinton for her use of a private email server as Secretary of State. Meanwhile, the New York Times is reporting Jared Kushner's brother, Josh Kushner, traveled to Saudi Arabia in October 2017, seeking investors for his venture capital firm just days before Jared Kushner also traveled to Saudi Arabia to meet with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman on White House business. Government ethics lawyers say Josh Kushner's visit posed a potential conflict of interest. It came just 1 week before the Crown Prince ordered Saudi police to arrest arrest about 200 prominent businessmen and former officials, holding them captive in Riyadh's Ritz-Carlton Hotel, where many later said they were tortured. New Zealand broadcast the Islamic call to prayer nationwide and observed 2 minutes of silence as the nation marked 1 week since a white supremacist terrorist attacked 2 mosques in Christchurch, killing 50 people. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, dressed in black, wearing hijab, addressed mourners at a public park adjacent to the Al-Noor Mosque, where most of the victims of last week's massacre were attacked during Friday prayers on March 15th, 42 killed.
The Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said, the believers in the mutual kindness, compassion, and sympathy are just like one body. When any part of the body suffers, the whole body feels pain. New Zealand mourns with you. We are one.
The New Zealand memorial was held as unknown assailants used sledgehammers to vandalize 5 mosques in the British city of Birmingham. Muslim groups say far-right extremists likely carried out the attacks. Florida resident Cesar Sayoc pleaded guilty Thursday to 65 felony counts for sending pipe bombs last year to prominent Democrats, CNN, and other critics of President Trump. When Sayoc was arrested last October, he was living in a van covered in pro-Trump and Pence stickers, as well as images of prominent Democrats with crosshairs over their faces. The New York Times reports Boeing airplanes that recently crashed in Indonesia and Ethiopia both lacked optional safety features that could have saved the lives of 346 people. Both Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 lacked an angle of attack indicator and an angle of attack disagree light, indicators that Boeing offers only at additional cost. This comes as families of victims of last October's Lion Air crash say they were pressured by the airline to sign a pledge not to pursue legal action against the company in exchange for about $90,000 in compensation. The amount was the minimum the families were entitled to under Indonesian law. In Mosul, Iraq, at least 92 people were killed Thursday after a ferry capsized and sank in the Tigris River. Many of the dead were children. The ferry was overloaded with people celebrating the Kurdish New Year, marking the start of spring. In eastern China, an explosion at a pesticide plant in the city of Yanqing Thursday killed at least 47 people, left scores more seriously injured. A government inspection of the plant last year showed more than a dozen violations, including a lack of safety training for managers. It's the worst industrial disaster in China since a 2015 explosion in Tianjin killed more than 170 people. Back in the United States, residents of the city of Deer Park outside Houston, Texas, have been ordered to shelter in place due to dangerous levels of toxic benzene kicked up by a massive fire at a petrochemical plant. The fire began Sunday and has since continued to spew acrid smoke across the region. A recently filed federal lawsuit charges the company behind the explosion, Intercontinental Terminals Company, with illegally dumping more than 1 million gallons of hazardous waste into floodwaters during Hurricane Harvey in 2017 in an effort to save money. A new analysis by the Environmental Working Group finds 70% of fresh produce sold across the United States is contaminated with pesticide. Topping the list of contaminated produce are strawberries and spinach, while more than 9 out of 10 samples of kale were found to contain residues of pesticides, with some leaves containing up to 18 different chemical compounds. Facebook admitted Thursday hundreds of millions of users' passwords were stored in a database that was accessible by more than 20,000 employees at the social media giant. The latest privacy breach at Facebook comes as Massachusetts Senator and 2020 presidential hopeful Elizabeth Warren has unveiled a plan to break up tech giants, including Facebook, Google, and Amazon. European Union officials have ordered the United Kingdom a short extension for its plans to leave the European Union. European Council President Donald Tusk said Thursday he'll roll back the deadline for Brexit from March 29th to April 12th, but only if British lawmakers approve a Brexit plan they've already rejected twice.
The UK government will still have a choice of a deal no deal, a long extension, or revoking Article 50. The 12th of April is a key date in terms of the UK deciding whether to hold European Parliament elections. If it has now decided to do so by then, the option of a long extension will automatically become impossible.
In Wisconsin, a state judge has blocked legislation passed by lame duck Republicans seeking to strip the incoming Democratic administration of power while protecting policies enacted by former Governor Scott Walker. A Dane County Circuit Court judge sided with civil rights groups who challenged the power grab as a legislative coup that violated Wisconsin's Constitution. Republicans in Michigan and North Carolina passed similar bills after losses in November elections. Advisors to former Vice President Joe Biden are reportedly considering Georgia Democrat Stacey Abrams as an out-of-the-gate vice presidential running mate when Biden announces his candidacy for the 2020 presidency next month. Abrams narrowly lost Georgia's gubernatorial race last year to Republican Secretary of State Brian Kemp of Georgia, who was widely accused of suppressing the vote. In New York, 6 women have accused billionaire donor Michael Steinhardt of carrying out sexual harassment over the course of decades. In interviews with ProPublica and the New York Times, the women say Steinhardt regularly propositioned sex and threesomes while making unwelcome comments about women's bodies. Steinhardt has denied many of the allegations. Steinhardt co-founded Birthright Israel and has donated about $25 million to the nonprofit. The group provides free trips to Israel to young Jewish Americans, promoting Israeli government policies while avoiding discussion of Israel's West Bank settlements and its occupation of Palestinian lands. And in Alabama, officials at Holman Prison have cut off water to the cells of 8 prisoners on hunger strike as they protest conditions and solitary confinement. Officials say prisoners will instead be offered bottled water every half hour so they can monitor the prisoners' liquid intake. The prisoners were placed in solitary housing units in February 28th without warning. They say they committed no infraction or violation of prison rules. Instead, they were told in a letter from prison officials, quote, "You will remain in restrictive housing and preventative status for peace and tranquility of the institution." The Southern Poverty Law Center has sued Holman Prison, saying its heavy reliance on solitary confinement violates the Constitution's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Just weeks before major elections in Israel that could determine the future of the embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, President Trump has bowed to his pressure by declaring the U.S. will recognize Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights in defiance of international law and decades of U.S. policy. Trump announced the move via Twitter Thursday, writing, "After 52 years, it's time for the United States to fully recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which is of critical strategic and security importance to the state of Israel and regional stability!" Exclamation point. Netanyahu responded to the news during a joint news conference with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
President Trump has just made history. I called him. I thanked him on behalf of the people of Israel. He did it again. First, he recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the U.S. embassy here. Then he pulled out of the disastrous Iran treaty and reimposed sanctions. But now he did something of equal historic importance. He recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And he did so at a time when Iran is trying to use Syria as a platform to attack and destroy Israel. And the message that President Trump has given the world is that America stands by Israel.
The Golan Heights area covers less than 500 square miles along Israel's northeastern border with Syria. Israel annexed the Golan Heights in 1981 after capturing the territory from Syria during the 1967 war, but the international community does not recognize its sovereignty. In November, the U.S. said it planned to vote against a UN resolution calling for Israel to end its occupation of the Golan Heights. The Syrian state news agency responded to Trump's vow to overturn decades of U.S. policy by saying it showed the, quote, blind hidden bias of the U.S. towards Israel, and that his comments had shown contempt for international law and that they would not change the reality, quote, that the Golan was and will remain Syrian, Arab, unquote. Chief Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat tweeted Thursday, yesterday President Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Today, for regional stability, he wants to make sure the occupied Syrian Golan Heights be under Israel's sovereignty. What shall tomorrow bring? Certain destabilization and bloodshed in our region, he tweeted. Trump's announcement comes as he's set to host Netanyahu at the White House next week and the annual conference of AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, where Vice President Mike Pence will speak, along with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, and others. This comes as a growing number of Democrats, including at least 8 presidential candidates, have said they will be skipping the summit, including Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Beto O'Rourke, and Pete Buttigieg. For more, we go to D.C., where we're joined by Noura Erakat, Palestinian human rights attorney, legal scholar. She's an assistant professor at George Mason University. Her new book, Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. Professor Erakat, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you respond to Trump's tweet?
I think when Netanyahu says that Trump did it again, he's absolutely right. Trump has been moving in lockstep in a imperial policy, U.S. imperial policy in the Middle East, which seeks to establish its hegemony, undermine democratic governance, and certainly continue the systematic violations of human rights. Israel is not interested in the Golan Heights for security. If it were interested in that, then it wouldn't be settling its civilians there. It has 34 settlements, 20,000 settlers. To put civilians into a place that's known as a military zone is, one, either to belie that there's actually a military threat, or two, to be using Israeli citizens as human shields. In both instances, it's incredibly problematic and discounts the fact that there is no military threat to Israel from that border. Syria last launched a military attack on Israel in October 1973. Egypt and Jordan have established permanent peace with Israel. Iraq and Libya, which might pose a threat rhetorically, have been completely gutted and destabilized. There has been no threat. Even Hezbollah from the south of Lebanon, where Israel withdrew its forces in 2000, have not launched war against Israel. In fact, it was Israel that launched war against Lebanon in 2006. This framework of security is a cover and a veneer for Israel as an aggressor. It is not the David, it is the Goliath in the region, and Israel's continuing warfare is what's destabilizing the region.
I want to go to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who spoke at Thursday's news conference with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Tonight, President Trump made the decision to recognize that hard-fought real estate, that important place, is proper to be a sovereign part of the state of Israel. President Trump made a bold decision to recognize that, an important decision for the people of Israel. It will truly be historic, and the people of Israel should know that the battles they fought, the lives that they lost on that very ground were worthy.
Noura Erakat, can you respond to Secretary of State Pompeo?
I think it's so irresponsible for a Secretary of State to be describing occupied territory recognized under international law, including UN Security Council Resolution 242 and 338, as hard-fought real estate. This violates a long-held principle that decries the acquisition of territory by force. And so I would say to Pompeo, you're doing an incredible disservice to your job. You're an embarrassment to yourself. This is not the message that we should be sending. The principle opposing the acquisition of territory by force isn't just relevant to the Middle East, but is relevant to the world. If we're going to say this in the Middle East, then we might as well tell Russia, you can stay as long as you want in Crimea, because you also won that territory, won that real estate by warfare. And so this is an embarrassment to the United States, to Pompeo, and certainly a bad signal for the entire world.
And what exactly does it mean, Noura? I mean, Trump tweeted this, that he plans to do this. What would have to happen to make it real?
You're absolutely right to question what is the value of a tweet. This is about the U.S. Now, it's within the presidential authority to recognize territory as sovereign. even if it violates international law. What will be consequential is how the international community responds. The UN has already decried this. Turkey has decried this. Egypt has decried this. Jordan has. Ironically, Russia has as well. And so if we see the international community stand in opposition, then the U.S.'s declaration will be merely that, a declaration where the U.S. is a lone figure in the rest of the world. Consider that when it moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, in similar contravention of long-held principles, 128 states at the UN voted against the U.S., and there have been very few countries that have followed suit. So, in fact, what this demonstrates is the weakness of the United States and its waning influence, and it says more about domestic concerns in the U.S. and Israel than it does for the region. This is about Netanyahu deflecting attention from corruption charges 3 weeks ahead of elections. This is about the United States and Trump speaking to an evangelical base rather than that doesn't care for regional stability and international law, but is more concerned with seeing Israel establishing itself as a hegemon within an Islamophobic framework that positions Israel as the easternmost front of the U.S.'s war on terror.
So this clearly is something that the embattled Prime Minister Netanyahu has been pushing Trump very hard for. The Israeli Attorney General has said he's about to indict Netanyahu for corruption. The election is just weeks away in Israel. Can you talk about the significance of this, what it will mean for the Israeli elections, Noura?
So one can only speculate what it's going to mean, but what we know about Israeli society is that it has a position in regards to the Golan Heights that signifies that the Golan Heights is part of Israel. It's similar to the mythologies that are created. They have a slogan, Ramat Golan Ze Ani, that the Golan Heights are me. And so this is speaking to a base that would be more concerned with establishing Israel's expansionist policies than it is with the corruption of a particular politician. It's a deflection tactic similar to Pompeo's visit right now. Secretary of State Pompeo is the first U.S. Official to visit the Western Wall in occupied East Jerusalem in a similar bid to establish that if you work with Netanyahu, you will be in lockstep with an imperial power that where might makes right in the Middle East, where there is no accountability and where Israel will be able to trample Palestinian human rights, will continue to act as an aggressor in the Middle East and continue to benefit from the U.S.'s unequivocal financial, military, and diplomatic support that frames that aggression as self-defense.
And what does this mean for the, if you can call it, the Israel-Palestine peace process, if there even is one? But what does this mean for any kind of pursuit of peace?
Well, I think if we just pay attention to what Israeli leaders have told us, they don't want peace. They don't want a two-state solution. What they're offering to Palestinians is a situation of permanent subjugation and derivative sovereignty where they don't control Jerusalem, where they can't access their water, where they can't access free movement, where there is no human rights. And now if we thought that Palestinians, who are a stateless people, had any chance of achieving some sort of equitable resolution with the U.S. as broker, we can see that the fact that the U.S. is willing to declare Israel's sovereignty over Syrian territory, which is not, in Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza has been subject to a really silly and basically indefensible legal argument that says that there is no Palestinian sovereign and so the territories are disputed. But there is no dispute over the Golan Heights. That is Syrian sovereign territory. If the U.S. is willing to stand by Israel to declare that sovereign territory as no longer occupied by decree, then what chances do Palestinians have of achieving any kind of equitable resolution for themselves? This just adds more imperative to a grassroots campaign in the form of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, in the form of legal cases, in the form of grassroots movements that are aligning in an anti-racist global movement and a global anti-fascist movement in order to overcome diplomatic intransigence and the fact that their governments do not represent them. This is more fuel to the fire for people's movements, and as we've seen, people do overcome.
Earlier this month, Senator Lindsey Graham visited the Golan Heights with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. He said he would lobby the Trump administration to recognize the occupied Golan Heights as Israeli territory.
There is no construct I can imagine now or any time in the future for the State of Israel to give the Golan up. The Golan is not in dispute. The Golan is in the hands of Israel and will always remain in the hands of Israel.
I agree.
So, we will be talking to President Trump when I get back about the necessity of recognizing the Golan as part of Israel, that it is inconceivable that Israel could ever give it to anyone, given the threats Israel faces.
So Lindsey Graham was standing next to David Friedman, the U.S. ambassador to Israel. Friedman has no diplomatic experience, worked as a bankruptcy lawyer for Donald Trump for 15 years, longtime supporter of illegal Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank, who's called President Barack Obama an anti-Semite. Friedman also compared liberal American Jews to Nazi collaborators. Noura Erakat.
I mean, I think what we see in the Middle East is, you know, we might be saying that the Trump administration doesn't know what it's doing and is actually appointing these ill-qualified officials to represent them. But I think that's precisely the plan. It's a plan of recklessness. It's a plan of might makes right. It's a plan of destroying what they can as they go in order to, one, shrink government in the United States, but also establish U.S. hegemony through military force. What we see between the U.S. and Israel in terms of supporting Israel at all costs is not unique just to Israel, but also in alignment with the U.S.'s policies to other authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, including its relationship to Sisi in Egypt, including the relationship to MBS in Saudi Arabia, as well as the UAE. This is not just about the U.S.'s relationship to Israel. This is about U.S. imperial policy in the Middle East. It's about establishing itself as a hegemon. It's about destabilizing the region. It's about undermining democratic rule. It's about being able to control access to natural resources like gas and petrol. It's about being able to proliferate U.S. military bases in the region that will have access and control to the rest of the world. And we do that under the veneer of liberation and democracy and peacemaking. And so it's really imperative upon a critical audience to understand that endless war in the Middle East cannot possibly be for the sake of stability or democracy, but is actually in pursuit of U.S. national imperial interests.
And Noura Erakat, I wanted to ask you about the elections in Israel and a campaign ad. A member of parliament seeking re-election on April 9th is under fire over a campaign advertisement depicting him shooting and killing a Palestinian colleague. In the ad, Oren Hazan, a lawmaker with the ruling Likud party who represents a Jewish-only West Bank settlement, is depicted as a character in the Clint Eastwood film The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Hazan's face is superimposed over a character who shoots and kills Jamal Zahalka, a Palestinian citizen of Israel and member of Israel's Knesset. Zahalka has called for police to arrest Hazan over the ad. This comes after another prominent Israeli politician, ex-General Benny Gantz, released a campaign video showing a counter marking a rising death toll of Palestinians superimposed over a video of a funeral. A second campaign ad promised that, if elected, Gantz would bomb Gaza back to the Stone Age. Your response?
Yeah, welcome to Israel. Welcome to Palestinian lives of being literally dehumanized, killed, ridiculed, accused, and blamed for their own deaths for the sake of domestic politics, for the sake of international politics, while the rest of the world watches. When Israel massacred 58 Palestinians on May 15th last year, when the embassy was moved, and when Palestinians continued their Gaza Great March of Return, you know what U.S. headlines ran? They said, how dare Hamas ruin and spoil Israeli celebrations? The level of dehumanization that is at play is astounding, absolutely astounding, and it's what should make us support more forcefully brave lawmakers like Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, like Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who are actually who have ridden into Congress, on the power of the people who have brought them into Congress, on campaigns that support human rights and a complete anti-racist platform, who are actually calling out the U.S.'s policy for what it is. Now, it should not be surprising that the U.S., which is a settler colony and also maintains a racial caste system, would also frame what Israel is doing as somehow forgivable. But there's something to be said about media that fails to let Israel speak for themselves and take them at face value. Here are campaign ads where they are promoting the murder and the killing and the death of Palestinians, even elected lawmakers, in order to get more votes. Can you imagine how precarious Palestinian life is? And when Zahadka called out Hazan for the ad, Hazan turned around and called him, that literally said, "This is not anti-Arab racism, you terrorist." I mean, we're talking about a doublespeak, and if you didn't see it, you wouldn't believe it. And so the only thing that I would encourage is for more people to pay attention, for more people to see it, for more people to take Israelis seriously when they use this racist discourse, and to understand that the people who pay the highest price are Palestinians.
Noura Erakat, I want to thank you for being with us. Palestinian human rights attorney, legal scholar, assistant professor at George Mason University. Her new book, Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. This is Democracy Now! Coming up, it has been called the worst weather event in the Southern Hemisphere. We're going to talk about what's happening right now in Mozambique and Zimbabwe and Malawi and other places, then to Nebraska, and finally, the Lakota historian Nick Estes on Our History is the Future. Stay with us. Samukela by Zena Abakar. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to the worst weather disaster in the history of the Southern Hemisphere, Cyclone Idai has caused extensive flooding and left behind what looks like inland oceans since it made landfall last Thursday, battering Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi. The World Meteorological Organization has called the storm the Southern Hemisphere's worst tropical cyclone on record. Officials say the death toll is over 400. The number is expected to rise. More than 400,000 people could be displaced in Mozambique. And President Filipe Nyusi said as many as 1,000 people may have been killed. The World Food Program warned of a major humanitarian emergency that's getting bigger by the hour. This is WFP Emergencies Director Margot van der Velden.
Confronted with severe flooding and cyclone effects, 600,000 people affected, possibly even going up to 1.7 and more million people affected by cyclone and flooding. Communication completely broken, infrastructure severely damaged, particularly in the city of Beira, but also all the roads to Beira have been cut off.
Rescue workers in the flooded city of Beira struggled to reach survivors who clung to trees or pleaded for help from rooftops after 90% of the coastal city, which is home to 500,000 people, was destroyed. This is a survivor of the cyclone in Beira.
There is someone up there. There is a big tree over there. This person is sitting on that tree since Friday until today, without food or anything. How are they supposed to live? So I'm going there to help. There are other people needing help there, full of them actually. I already rescued my family, always using this canoe.
Cyclone Idai dropped more than 2 feet of rain in parts of southeastern Africa, nearly a year's worth of rain in just a few days. An extreme weather event that climate scientists say is consistent with models of climate change. For more, we are joined by Dipti Bhatnagar by Democracy Now! Video stream. She's usually based in Maputo, Mozambique, where she's climate justice and energy coordinator at Friends of the Earth International, but is joining us from Penang, Malaysia. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Dipti. Can you explain the extent of the damage?
Thanks, Amy. It's really heartbreaking to be away from home at a time like this. But interestingly enough, we've been at a climate justice meeting here in Penang, Malaysia. And back home, our communities, our people are getting battered from all sides by this disaster. So, of course, as you said right now, the cyclone Idai has hit the coast, and then it's gone inland into Zimbabwe and Malawi and affecting hundreds of thousands of people and wiping out 90% of the city of Beira. I live in the south, in the capital in Maputo, and that area has not been hit. But we are in touch with people in Beira, family, friends, family of colleagues who have been hit. And we are still waiting for information from a lot of people that we haven't heard from. And of course, this is a huge disaster to have hit Mozambique. And already about 2 weeks ago, when I was home, we heard of a lot of flooding happening in the Tete province, which is the Zambezi River Basin. So basically, there are two river basins that have been affected by flooding, and people sort of trapped in between. And some of it is related to the cyclone, and some of it is related to rain upstream in the catchment and the dams in Zimbabwe letting go of water, and that's also affected a lot of people. And as you just heard, it's absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, you've had people stuck on rooftops, you've had people stuck without water and food, and a lot of organizations from Mozambique, including mine, which is Justiça Ambiental, meaning environmental justice, from the capital, which is Friends of the Earth Mozambique, has been trying to do whatever we can to support the relief efforts, because the very most urgent thing that's needed right now is to be able to get emergency relief to people who are still could have a chance to survive.
Hundreds of thousands have been displaced over the past week because of Cyclone Idai, where residents of affected areas are describing the devastation.
I thought we would all be dead. My home collapsed and my daughter had...
I was with my children inside our home, talking because it was raining, and then we heard the mountain exploding, and then the water started flowing through the streets and arrived at our house, and we had to run away.
Here, we don't have anything to eat here. No food, nothing. It's a problem. At night, we don't eat. We don't even have a blanket to cover ourselves with. We only have the clothes we are wearing. It's hard to die. We want to live, but we suffer. We have been suffering until today.
Dipti Bhatnagar, can you talk about the link between climate change and this cyclone?
Absolutely, Amy. I think, there always have been cyclones in the Indian Ocean, but the intensity of it is getting much stronger, and the breadth of it is getting a lot stronger. So I'm wearing a T-shirt which shows you the map of Mozambique, and of course you see Madagascar, which actually protects Mozambique from these types of events in the Indian Ocean. But as the intensity has increased due to warming oceans and due to the climate crisis, this type of extreme weather event is impacting and hitting with so much more intensity. So we, in Mozambique, we've always known that we are going to be really impacted by climate change. We are a downstream country. We are a very, very flat country, and we have faced floods before, and we knew that this is going to be our fate, that as the oceans warm and as the atmosphere warms, this is going to have direct impacts on our people, and that's what you see happening right now.
Kenyan author Shailia Patel called out ExxonMobil over its involvement in Mozambique amidst the climate disaster, writing, ExxonMobil, which is developing giant gas deposits off northern Mozambique, said it would donate $300,000 to relief efforts. ExxonMobil's 2018 quarterly profits, $6 billion, $300,000 is less than 7 minutes of their 2018 profits. Author and activist Naomi Klein retweeted Patel's tweet, adding, "Tell Exxon to pay its climate debts starting right now." Dipti Bhatnagar, your response.
I absolutely agree with that analysis from Shailja and from Naomi. I mean, Mozambique did not create this climate crisis. Our people have contributed almost nothing to the climate crisis, but this is the irony of the climate crisis, that it affects those who did not do anything to create it, and it affects those the most. So the poorest and the most vulnerable people on the planet are going to be affected the most, and that's what's happening in Mozambique right now. And we really want to call out those who are responsible. So this is about the rich countries, Amy, where you are sitting at the moment, the United States. This is about Europe and Australia and Japan. And for years, your societies have built up, your societies using the fossil fuels. And now we know this is what it's caused in the atmosphere. So we call out the rich countries. Even the UK government has promised some amount of money, but the UK government just a few days ago has approved a new coal mine in their territory. So this is an absolute affront. You know, we need to deal with the climate crisis. We need to stop dirty energy, dirty and harmful energies everywhere. But this is about historical responsibilities. So that needs to happen in the northern countries first, to stop fossil fuels, to stop dirty and harmful energies. And then, as you said, we don't want this in our countries either. So our organization, Justiça Ambiental, is fighting against that exploitation of gas in the very north of Mozambique, right under Tanzania. And it's ExxonMobil that's involved, it's Eni from Italy that's involved, and it's Anadarko, which is another U.S. corporation. And we have been working with a group of allies from all over the world because there is a huge rush for this gas field in Mozambique. And we are going to fight because we don't want dirty energy in our countries either. I mean, 70% of the people of Mozambique don't have access to electricity. And obviously, the situation is going to get much worse after this disaster because of how many power lines have been knocked off and because of how many villages have disappeared. But this is not the way to get energy. We don't have any more space to keep emitting these greenhouse gas emissions and to have this horrible, dirty energy, which is affecting people on the ground. We're pushing for repayment of the climate debt, which means we didn't create the crisis. So those who did, give us the finance to be able to actually deal with this on the ground. And, you know, we want to fight for people-centered renewable energy for our people. That's the future that we want to see. And of course, this disaster has showed us that we need to be able to build up the resilience of our people. We need to have survival strategies for people because the ocean is coming into people's houses. I mean, agriculture is going to start failing. We're seeing impacts intensifying all over the world. And how are the poorest and the most vulnerable people who don't have these strategies of survival, how are they actually going to live? So this is what we are fighting for: repayment of the climate debt, stop the dirty and harmful energies, and let's have an energy transformation towards people-centered renewable energy. That's what we're fighting for.
Dipti Bhatnagar, I was wondering if you can end by talking about the significance of the climate school strike led by Greta Thunberg in Sweden, who's just been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, the 16-year-old climate activist. Millions of young people walked out of schools across the world. And also what's happening in the United States with this new Congress, the most diverse Congress in U.S. history, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the New York Congress member, pushing for the Green New Deal. What this looks like from your vantage point in Mozambique and right now in Malaysia, where you're at a climate summit, the same country that's historically the biggest greenhouse gas emitter, and where President Trump has pulled the United States out of the UN climate summit and the Paris Peace Accord. Well, not the summit. They go to push fossil fuels, but the Paris Climate Accord.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful question. Actually, we've been meeting with some of the Malaysian activists who organized the strike in the city of Penang last week on Friday. And I think it's wonderful what's happening across the world, initiated from Greta Thunberg in Sweden, who our team from Friends of the Earth were with her, and allies were with her in the Poland UN climate negotiations last December. I think it's absolutely wonderful. And what she's saying about system change is very, very critical, because that is what is going to take. That level of transformation is what we need to be able to stop the climate crisis, but also to serve the people who the current system never served, those who don't have electricity and those who struggle to have food on the table. I mean, we're talking about a world of increasing inequality. So we, as Friends of the Earth Mozambique, as Friends of the Earth International, we are really pushing for this transformational agenda, and I was really happy to see Greta actually talking about it. However, I don't think that the school strikers in some of the other countries are actually making those links, and that's where I think we want to offer a connection. Those of us from the South, from the southern countries, we would love to talk to you. We would love to talk to the school strikers. We would love to talk to those in the parliament in the US who are pushing this Green New Deal to say this is absolutely wonderful what you're doing. Let's not forget about equity. Let's not forget about the South. Let's not forget about historical responsibility. So I think the work that's happening is wonderful. I think we want to make sure that they realize we are also in the boat with them, us in the South, and that there is a responsibility that they have, not just to stopping climate change, but actually doing it in an equitable way. So I'm offering myself, I'm available anytime to speak to school strikers, to speak with people in the US Congress, our allies. We've just been talking about this at our climate justice meetings. We really want to reach out. We really need to strengthen the narrative of equity and of historical responsibility within the climate strikes, within the Green New Deal. I think there are wonderful opportunities, but I think we need to remember the South.
I want to thank you very much as you talk about remembering the South. Dipti Bhatnagar with Friends of the Earth International, Climate Justice and Energy Coordinator, usually based in Maputo, Mozambique, but joining us now from a climate justice conference in Penang, Malaysia. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Lakota historian Nick Estes on his new book, Our History is the Future. Stay with us. Directions by Juana Rios featuring Nako. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. While the Southern Hemisphere faces its worst tropical cyclone on record, states across the Midwestern United States are continuing to recover from unprecedented flooding this week that devastated communities in Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, and particularly Nebraska. Warming temperatures, snowmelt, and heavy rainfall led to a flash flood that overwhelmed the Missouri River. The rising waters breached levees, killing at least 4 people, destroying or damaging thousands of homes. Much of the news about the flooding has focused its impact on farmers, but the climate change-fueled weather has also hit Native American communities hard, with 4 tribal nations in Nebraska declaring a state of emergency. This is Larry Wright, Jr., chair of the Ponca tribe of Nebraska, speaking last week.
Today, I've declared a state of emergency for the Ponca tribe of Nebraska in our territory as it relates to our homeland in Niobrara, as well as our communities in Norfolk and Sioux City. And we'll continue to monitor the situation as we move forward with the flooding.
Scientists warn that more flooding is on the way as a climate change-fueled extreme weather patterns around the planet. Santee Sioux chairman Roger Trudell, whose tribe faced unprecedented flooding in Nebraska, told Earther, quote, "I'm just sorry that our national leaders, the people with the power to do something about it, just put their head in the sand and pretend that there's no such thing as climate change or global warming or anything when it's so evident. They should be ashamed of themselves," he said. For more, we go to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where we're joined by a Lakota historian who says that the history of indigenous resistance can offer a roadmap for collective liberation and a guide to fighting life-threatening climate change. In his new book, Our History is the Future, Nick Estes tracks how 2 centuries of indigenous resistance created the movement at Standing Rock proclaiming water is life. Estes is assistant professor of American Studies at University of New Mexico, co-founder of the indigenous resistance group, the Red Nation. He is a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. Professor Estes, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you respond to what's happened in the Midwest from Nebraska on, and particularly talk about the effects on Native Americans?
Right. So this history of flooding actually goes back to the 1930s when the Missouri River flooded a lot of towns downriver, and the United States government, under the auspices of the Green Deal, or the New Deal, proposed a series of earthen-rolled dams on the main stem of the river to prevent flooding downriver in places like Kansas that are experiencing flooding right now. And so in places like Lower Brule, where I'm from, they built the Big Bend Dam, and then upriver from there, they built the Oahe Dam to have sort of flood control for downriver states. And so what we're seeing right now is just a continuation of the mismanagement of that river and the flooding that's being caused specifically by the Army Corps of Engineers. These dams dislocated and forcefully removed about 1/3 of our river reservation populations, including my own community. In places like Fort Berthold, about 80% of the tribal population was removed. And so what we're experiencing right now is a continuation of the legacy of the Pick Sloan dams that were built to prevent this kind of disaster. And so in many ways, we have a compounding of issues with the unusual weather cycles, the torrential rain, and then couple that with the fact that the government shut down for 35 days, preventing a lot of tribal communities that are now affected by this flood from getting heating assistance during the winter time. And so it's a combination of things that are at work here. And at the end of the day, we have to remember that this, while it is related to climate change in the present, it's also related to the altering of the environment, and specifically the annihilation of the river ecosystem to provide sort of flood control in the first place.
Nick Estes, you're talking about the New Deal back in FDR's time. Mm-hmm. You say the Green New Deal really was born out of the standoff at Standing Rock. Explain.
So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, before she became a congresswoman, she was also a water protector. She was at Standing Rock, and she's even said this in her interviews, where she began her campaign in the resistance camps and the prayer camps at Standing Rock, and specifically Ocheti Shakoi camp. And so when people are asking, where's the inspiration of the Green New Deal, we can really locate it at Standing Rock, where you had sort of the transition from one administration, the Obama administration, to the Trump administration. And I believe Ocasio-Cortez was at Standing Rock after November 8th, 2016, when the election of Trump really caught a lot of people by surprise. And the irony of that was, there was a massive resistance movement against the construction and the expansion of carbon infrastructure led by indigenous people at Standing Rock. But in reality, that pipeline was an extension of Obama-era energy policies. And so if we go back to 2007 and 2008 and look at the North American oil boom, that really happened around the time of the Great Recession. And so in many ways, the United States, along with countries like Canada, drilled their way out of the Great Recession, largely at the expense of indigenous lands. And what I mean by that is if we look at the oil sands in Alberta, Canada, and we think about the Dakota Access Pipeline, which indigenous people, my people, the Lakota people, call the Black Snake, the Alberta tar sands is really the snake pit where a lot of these oil pipelines are snaking out across the country, and specifically traversing and trespassing through indigenous communities and putting them at risk. And so when we think about things such as the Green New Deal and their impact on indigenous communities, we have to remember that the inspiration for that and really the frontline communities that inspired this were communities like Standing Rock and indigenous communities, not just in the United States, but throughout North America or what we call Turtle Island. And so when we talk about what's happening, the flooding, the massive flooding that's happening in places like southeastern Africa, we can connect it to the oil production in the United States and in North America in general, because the United States has now surpassed countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia when it comes to oil production. And we can look at places like the Bakken oil region where the Dakota Access Pipeline was originating from as sort of being ground zero for this this new sort of climate deal that needs to take place because it affects indigenous communities first and foremost.
Nick, explain your title, Our History is the Future.
So that has two meanings. The first meaning is sort of a negative meaning in the sense that the Oceti Sakowin, the Great Sioux Nation, has undergone several apocalypses, going back to the fur trade and the annihilation of fur-bearing animals in our region, going back to the annihilation of the buffalo to take the land and to starve us into surrender. Going back to the mid-20th century damming of the Missouri River, and now the North American sort of oil boom. These are different rounds of dispossession that we see in a long continuum, right? And while history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, there's echoes that the United States has bailed itself out largely at the expense of indigenous peoples and indigenous lands. And so in many ways, what we're trying to prevent is that history in the future. But the other more sort of positive and generative aspect of that is our history is the future in the sense that we have a long tradition of resistance to these sort of U.S.-imposed climate catastrophes on our own community, and we draw from the resistance movements going back to the first time we halted the trespass of Lewis and Clark through our territories and said, no, we are a sovereign nation. We have protection. We are the protectors of the Missouri River. Going back to the 19th century Indian Wars, and then, my grandparents were water protectors in their own right because they fought for and tried to defend the Missouri River by preventing the construction of the Pick Sloan dams in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so in many ways, I am just a product of my ancestors' resistance. They were water protectors before, and we have a new generation of water protectors now. And the great thing about that is that it's not just an indigenous fight, as we saw at Standing Rock, as we see with the Green New Deal, that it's being taken up by non-indigenous relatives and allies. And so we're living in a moment where indigenous issues, or the Indian problem as it has been defined in the past, is no longer seen as just an Indian problem, and that now, because of climate change, it's all of our problems. And so in many ways, our history is the future because we led that first resistance against the destruction of the environment, and we will continue to lead it as the Green New Deal takes effect, and we're demanding that as part of that Green New Deal program that a lot of these politicians take seriously what indigenous environmental movements have been demanding for the last decades, and to keep it in the ground policy. The way that we stop climate change is by stopping it at the source, meaning we need to keep oil and gas in in the ground.
And we're going to continue this discussion in part 2 and put it online at democracynow.org. Nick Estes, Assistant Professor of American Studies at University of New Mexico, author of the new book, Our History is the Future. And that does it for our broadcast. I'll be speaking at SUNY Purchase this weekend, Sunday at 1:30. Check democracynow.org. A very happy birthday to Miriam Barnard. And Democracy Now! Has an immediate job opening for a full-time junior systems administrator here in our New York City studio. Details at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Berkey, Nick Guzder, Renee Feltz, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.